So now let's talk about seeding the database with some data. We're going to use sample data, but you could imagine using the same facility to create lookup data, country codes, whatever it is, lookup whatever it is. A lot of times when you're building a database, you need some data to be included in it, even if it's just things like default users and those kinds of data. And that's what seeding the database is all about. For us, we're going to create a new class to do this, but there's nothing in Entity Framework that really defines what this looks like. The fact is that, at least in the current versions of Entity Framework 7, unlike earlier versions, there wasn't a plug-in place to obviously do this. We're going to go ahead and just write some code to do this as a workaround, though this workaround might end up becoming permanent because it's still unclear what the Entity Framework 7 team wants to do about seeding data. But this will teach you some interesting things about how using the startup to do some configuration and setup can actually be useful in your own applications. Over in the model folder, I'm going to create a new file that I'm going to call the world context seed data class. And so this is nothing more than just a class that performs the seeding. So let's go ahead and create a public method for doing this. And I'm going to call this ensure seed data, for lack of a better name. And we're going to use dependency injection to create this instance. And so we're going to need a copy of the context object. Now, because in the startup, we added the DB context here to the configure services service collection. That means we can use it as an injectable service. So we'll do the same thing we did with the app controller, and we'll just generate our own copy of this so that we can go ahead and use it to see the database. With our database here, what we want to do is we want to make this as quick of an operation as possible, but we want to see if there's anything in the database. And if not, we want to go ahead and create some instances of entities to save in the database. So I'm going to choose trips because I'm going to create a couple of trips and then a bunch of stops within them that are related to those trips. So I'm going to use the context object to just say trips.any. Now, just like before, because we're doing a link query, we're going to need link added to the namespace. There's no way to really automatically do that. And the any is just saying if there are any trips, I just want to know whether there's any trips. So this will make it a pretty brief call, but it's still going to be a database call. And then here we'll add new data. And what will this new data look like? It's really just going to be, call it the US trip, a new instance of our trip class. And I'm just going to use initialization to support this. So we'll call this our US trip. I'll set the created to be date time UTC now, so it'll be created, in fact, right now when we create it. We have a username, which will just include an empty string for now. We'll come back to that when we look at entities. And then we have stops. And what are the stops? It's actually going to be a list, bring in the collections of stops that we can then generate the individual stops for us. So we're literally just creating that internal data structure here, and then we're going to want to store the data in the world context for us. We're going to actually create a couple of trips. So let's call this one the world trip. So now let's populate the stops. The stop certainly could be populated by just creating a new stop object and then setting its properties. But over in the resources folder in the source code, you'll see two files called US trip and world trip. So I'm going to take the world trip and drag it over so it opens it. We can see that this is just the stop data. So I'm going to copy this for our US trip and just paste it in. And this is just the same as we could have typed. Name, arrival date with some dates formulated, longitude and latitude, as well as the order. And this is a somewhat brief trip in that it just has 6 stops and goes around the country and comes back to Atlanta. All good. For the world trip, I've actually supplied all of the stops we made during my post-marriage trip, the world trip that we took last year. So let's bring the world trip over. And you can see that there's actually 56 different stops. So we're going to save a not insignificant amount of data in our seeding. Come down here and add them all. And we have the data in different order, but that's not going to matter because the data is still going to be stored as an object or as a list of fields in an object that contain the same types of information, formatted a tad differently, but it's the same sort of operation. And now we're going to want to actually store these in the database. We have that context object supplied, so let's use it. So we're going to go to the trips and just add our new trip, US trip. Now, this object we have that contains the stops, you might assume that these stops are going to be added just because you've added the entire trip. And as of the current version of Entity Framework, that's not going to be the case. And I suspect that might continue to not be the case, just to make sure that no odd side effects happen. But what we can do is add the stops directly to the context as well. And I'm going to use add range to just say ustrip.stops. Go ahead and add each of those stops to the context as well. And we'll repeat that down here for the world trip. But all that adding these to the context has done is told the context that these are new objects that need to be updated in the database. It's not until we say context.saveChanges that those are actually pushed to the databases as changes. Now we could put in some error handling and logging here, but I want the error to actually be exposed out because if the seed data is failing, the whole site's probably not going to work. And so it's a pretty critical error. So let's talk about how we're actually going to use this, how this is actually going to be executed. Over in our startup folder, I want the world context seed data to be supplied during the configuration step. The reason I want it to be supplied here is I want the dependency injection layer to look at the parameters of the constructor where we're injecting that context object and supply it for me. If it supplies it, then the last step before we close out the configuration, we can just use it. But in order for it to be able to supply this class, we need to register it, just like we did here with the mail service. So I'm going to use the services to register it and say add, and I could say scoped and supply the type. I don't need to have an interface in order for this to work. I can give it just the type, and it will be that type that it creates a new instance of when someone requests it. But scoped actually behaves in a specific way that I want you to understand. Scoped says during the life of a request, it's going to reuse an instance of this class every time everybody needs it. And in our case for world context seed data, only one person is ever going to use it, and that is this configure step. So instead I'm going to use add transient, which always guarantees that we're getting a new instance of this class. Now there's no state associated with it, so it will probably work in either case, but I just like the cleanness of the transientness, so that once it gets passed in, it gets used, it can be destroyed pretty quickly so it's not hanging around for that reuse. The services supports a couple of others that I'll go ahead and talk about. One is add singleton, and this will make sure that during the lifetime of the web server that only one instance of this is ever used and is always passed out to everybody that needs it. A little overkill for what we need, but we can also add an instance. And this is where we would pass in some constructed object that is then passed around. The service no longer becomes responsible for creation and cleanup of that instance, but it does allow you for things that don't work well, that aren't friendly to dependency injection, to be able to pass those around as well. But again, for us, we'll go ahead and say add transient so that it can be then supplied in this one instance where we need it. So let's run this and see if the seed data will go ahead and fill up the database and add our new test data. We've gotten to our trips, but the trips equals 0. Now, why would this happen if we seeded a database? Let's go ahead and debug this so we can see what's happening. Go ahead and set a breakpoint there, and let's go ahead and refresh our page. We're still getting 0, and the seed context hadn't been touched. Why is that? Well, that's on purpose, because what happens is this startup is only called once every time the web server starts. We haven't stopped and restarted the instance of our application, which we can do by doing a clean rebuild and then running it. And then it will go ahead and call the startup again, which will take us into our seeding of the database. And immediately I can tell what our problem was. I said, if there are any trips, add data. Well, of course, that's a logic problem. It should be as long as there are no trips. Let me go ahead and rebuild again. And let's see if it works this time. Now we're in trips, and we can see that we're getting 2 trips, the US trip and the world trip. Now these aren't returning the actual stops, and that's because all we're doing is returning the trip objects, not the related objects yet. We'll talk a little bit about how to get those soon. But let's guarantee that we actually got all that stop data as well. We're going to use the Object Explorer to tell us that. There's our tables, and let's go ahead and use View Data. And here we can certainly see that we're getting all of that stop data as we expected. So we're now successfully seeding the database with our context object. Let's go ahead and introduce the repository so that we can see how we're actually going to get data and interact with the controllers themselves in a testable way.